So I'm so excited to be sitting here with Chris Ozuna and Benjamin James, who have both done really amazing interviews, international interviews with scholars from Japan and from Denmark. And I'm really excited to talk with them about their takeaways and their obstacles that they faced in encountering and creating this dialogue with scholars who have studied education for a very long time in their own countries and cultures, and bringing that to American pedagogy and American teacher education in particular. So whoever wants to start. What are some takeaways or other things?
What do you want us to talk about takeaways from our own interviews or from watching each other's, or
both?
I can start if you don't mind, Ben, but I think one of the things that stood out to me the most was how in all three locations, so the US, or I guess even specifically California, and then Denmark and in Japan, there's this sort of emphasis on social justice and trying to figure out how teacher education fits into the conversations that are happening in each of these places sort of on their own. That was interesting to me because I think in the US we talk a lot about that, and our history is definitely unique in kind of how things arrived to be where they're at. And I think also this moment in time, right, like coming just a couple years off of the Black Lives Matter protests from the summer of 2020, I think it really informs why we're talking about this now in the way that we are. So it's just interesting to hear what people in other countries are sort of grappling with, and how there's overlap, of course, but also how it's a different context. So
yeah, those overlaps to me were not, I mean, they were obviously were a key takeaway. That's one of the things we're hoping to kind of unravel a bit in these interviews. But it was really striking, especially in my interview with Ushiwata Sensei, like how similar some of the challenges that he was talking about are to some of the challenges that we often talk about, you know, like deprofessionalization of teachers,
yeah.
teacher shortage, you know, these neoliberal movements pushing more towards like alternative pathways. And, you know, and it was like so interesting to me to be able to, I mean, two contexts that are the California context and Japan national context, very, very different in a lot of ways. But then some of the problems that drive some of these research initiatives and drive some of these, you know, problem solving initiatives are the same, right? They start from some very similar sources, despite the context being quite different.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also interesting to think like this, the countries that we are focusing on have like a very long educational histories, like much longer than the United States has. But also it's, I don't know, I just think we're at this interesting moment in time where like the US really dominates a lot of conversation in international politics and culture. And I don't know, I mean, I could see that even in our interviews. Like Karin knows a lot about the US.
Yeah.
Because I think there isn't a way to not know a lot about, you know, US topics in these things. It seemed like with Ushiwata Sensei, it was this similar background of knowledge, but I wouldn't have had any like context of what's happening in Denmark unless I sought it out. And I don't know if it's the same for you in Japan, Ben, but.
Yeah, I mean, I was a teacher there for a long time, but it was at a private school, and you know, it was a dual language school, so half of the teaching force there were non-Japanese teachers from other countries, and the other half were teachers certified in Japan. But you know, it's the classic like apprenticeship of observation, right? Where you know, just because I was working in this context doesn't mean I understand the historical foundations of it, and to a certain degree, the ways I was teaching were not totally aligned with the ways that my Japanese teaching partners were, you know, were prepared, and their experiences they had in their teacher education program. So it was definitely interesting for me to hear someone who's so knowledgeable on the Japanese context to talk about it. and unravel some of those issues.
Right.
That's really interesting, thinking about the ways in which the two scholars that we've spoken to so far have a rich and deep knowledge of American teacher education and its trajectory, and yet we don't have as deep or any knowledge. It's not something we covered in any of our PhD programs, this international history. But hearing Karin and hearing Ushiwata sensei talk, like 20, 30, 40 years, they've been discussing this issue of social justice. And it's just like this aha moment from the popular kid on the globe, who's now pushing for these things. But really these countries, smaller countries, have been doing this work and thinking about this work very deeply. I mean, I'm thinking about both of them brought up, which I thought was really interesting, the student protests from in the 1960s, 70s, the Parisian protests that instigated a bunch of things, including here in the United States. But it's like we forgot about all that. Like, okay, now it's social justice now, but what about, in the 70s?
Right. And I think I don't really know the reasoning behind a lot of this, but it does make me wonder if part of a side effect of being in a country as large as the US or as influential as the US is it's easy for some of those things to either purposefully be obscured over time, or they just don't stay in the common discourse as much. But right, I mean, a lot of this work has been happening in the US for decades. But it doesn't drive, I don't know, the last few years seem like there's been a shift in how much it's been focused on than when I was in teacher training. So I do think that there's, I don't know, it kind of does a disservice to past scholars that really started these conversations.
And honoring those roots. I'm thinking now about what Dr. Zeichner said to the C. Tarrant Fellows last summer, thinking about like really knowing your history is really important, because when we talk about these reforms in teacher education, and then there's another reform, and then there's another reform, but really we're just painting, it's new wine in old bottles, or whatever the saying is. I can't tell, that didn't make sense. But whereas as both scholars, I feel like had this deep honoring of like, this is what we've been working towards. This is, I'm thinking about democratic citizenship and the idea of Bildung from Karin, and specifically as just this is working, we're standing on the shoulders of, which it's at our loss. Maybe it's because we're the new world or whatever, like we have to be new all the time and creative, but really just take a moment to honor and stand on the shoulders. I don't know.
Well, I during the interview, and Ushiwata Sensei and I had like a pre-interview where we got to know each other and we chatted a bit. But he had mentioned how important the Ryan Act was to him as a scholar. And he was like, the Ryan Act. And I was like, no, I don't know, actually, and he said it was such like matter of fact, and it was so important to his own journey as a teacher educator, and thinking about, the professionalization of teachers and the democratic movements for teachers and teacher certification. And I just had never heard of it, and it never even entered my sphere of like reference. And it was so important to him. And then looking into it, I was like, this is actually really interesting. And why don't I know? Why haven't I learned about this? But so to see how something which, as we're talking about here, like it isn't as present in our our view right now of teacher education, but it's so influential to him and others, I assume, in thinking about how they can take that kind of movement or that kind of historical context and apply it into their own situation.
Yeah. I also think that the United States, that our history with a lot of these issues like racism and social justice, our history is pretty well known, like worldwide, the bad parts and hopefully more good parts. But I think a side effect of that is I've noticed like in other countries, it sort of seems like it's easier to say like, well, we don't have that same kind of loaded history that the US has, like, especially when we think about slavery, or the fact that, like, for all of us, we have relatives who were alive when segregation was still the norm in this country. And that's not necessarily, it hasn't played out in other places in the same way. But while I do think the context is different, it also means that these other countries, I don't know, I still think we have a lot to learn from each other. We both talk to scholars from countries who have their own histories of kind of complicated relationships with neighbors, complicated histories with imperialism and colonialism. And again, it kind of gets to this issue of, I don't think most Americans sort of have as like ready a knowledge of, like, well, what's Japan's history with colonialism, or what's Denmark's, as people in those other countries have of ours, for better or for worse. So I just think that that's something to keep in mind, right? Like, not to call out other countries, but just to recognize, like, yeah, it's not the same as it is here, but there's still like a lot of work to be done around the globe, right? So I don't know, that's just something that stood out to me from our interviews, and then just from other conversations I've had in this area. So
thank you. Any other key takeaways?
Yeah, it was, and I think this is also an obstacle that I'm sure we'll talk about at some point in this interview, but just like how important, language and understanding some of the cultural norms and nuances, how important that is to making this interview really successful. Like, Ushiwata Sensei and I, like, we had this pre-interview, and the pre-interview was way longer than the actual interview itself. Like, we were chatting on Zoom for like over 2 hours, and getting to know each other, and the pre-interview was entirely in Japanese, and we were talking about some things that were challenging for me to talk about, things I have never talked about in Japanese before. But I felt like that was so important for me, and I'm assuming as well for Ushiwata Sensei, in like breaking down that kind of that affective filter, or this, the social barrier there of, like, we're going to do this very formal interview, but let's first get to know each other a little bit more, get comfortable with each other, get familiar with the topics that we're going to talk about, and this really making sure that, and how that pre-interview was so vital into making sure the interview was successful. And without that, I think it would have been really messy and awkward. And yeah, so that was really important, for at least in my specific interview.
Yeah, and I would say that for me, I mean, I was lucky in that I had been working with Karin for, months already in person in Denmark, and that we had been talking. I'd already known her for almost a year before we had the recorded interview, and it was the same experience. Like, that rapport had already been established, whereas if it was like a one-off, this was the first time we're really talking to each other, I think it would have been a very different experience, because I think we both trusted each other enough to know, like, okay, I can be a little more open with what I'm saying, and because I know you're going to interpret it, give me more grace in how this is being interpreted. And same thing, like, for Karin and I, our conversations are always in English, but that's her second language. So there's like that kind of piece I think it puts more of the onus on her. And I kind of, probably a similar experience for you, Ben, right? Where there's like, there's stuff kind of getting lost in translation, no matter how fluent the other person is. So
yeah, totally. I mean, and even for me, that pre-interview was way less formal space than the actual interview. And formal Japanese is very quite different than casual, everyday Japanese, and it's something that I struggle with in speaking Keigo, which is this kind of formal register of Japanese. So in the pre-interview, I was trying my best to be polite and to use the formal forms, and then Ushiwata Sensei was like, oh, you don't have to do Keigo, he was like, you don't have to do that. So it made me instantly feel at ease to, like, okay, I can talk a bit more fluently and more comfortably about some of these topics, even though maybe I'm not speaking the way. And if it was being recorded and to be an interview, I wouldn't have published it, right? I wasn't comfortable with that being our rapport in the interview. But for the pre-interview, it was super helpful, So just being understanding those nuances, especially in a language like Japanese that has, honorifics and things that are connected to status and the power balance between the relationship. So
And I know that Chris also did multiple rehearsals with Karin, right? Like, and she asked, right, just to.
Yeah, that's true. We kind of went through some of the questions in advance one or two times, and she did come to me with a list of terms that she was like, I think these are going to come up in our interview. This is how I've been translating them into English. Does this mean what I think it means? So right, we did sort of have some of that ironing out in advance, just to make sure we were talking about the same topics. So
yeah, same. We like went through a couple rounds of like typing up responses to the questions to make, and for Ushiwata say his English is very good and he's very comfortable in talking about these topics in English, obviously, as you can see in this interview, as I'm sure Karin was as well. Yeah. But he wants to get it right and he wants to make sure he's communicating it in the way that makes sense. And so definitely having those multiple rounds of support. And I would probably argue, like, if I was being formally interviewed, I would like that multiple rounds of be able to practice some of my answers in a language that I'm very comfortable with, like English, so. Yeah. But I also think, going back to what I was saying earlier, is that, especially in the Japanese context, I think, and again, I don't want to essentialize Japan, and it's a very diverse country, despite having a very homogenous reputation. It is a very diverse country and is changing and growing, every day. But in a kind of formal relationship, like a business relationship, there is a lot of like padding that leads up into the actual thing happening, right? Whatever that thing is, if it's a business deal or if it's like you're getting offered the position or you're having an interview, like there needs to be a certain degree of like meetings that happen and having tea and having drinks together, whatever. So I think even though it was on Zoom and we weren't in person, trying to kind of keep that in mind and build that, I think was super important. At least it was for me, and I hope it was well received for Ushiwata Sensei as well.
I would think that would be important in any relationship, like you just even mentioned, just professionally, but also if we're trying to engage in conversations with international scholars, I think that idea of language and giving time for building rapport, getting to know one another, leaving space for interpretation and for checkpoints. Had you just filmed it and then like, wait, that's not what I meant. And then you have all these pop-ups that are like, what's going on? Like, that's not what this term means in my country. Right. Even something as small as Ministry of Education, which we're not familiar with here in the United States, but that structure, and it has very different things come to mind than I think what it actually is. And then looking it up, having edited that interview, I'm like, oh, okay, I can see what this is and how it fits into the structure, et cetera. But that idea of language and building rapport with one another over time and space, even if it is just Zoom, if you're working on a paper with somebody, if you're going to a conference with somebody, if you're like interviews for sure, but in order to engage in these relationships and to really truly learn from one another, I think that idea is essential. Well, that combined idea of rapport. Over a year that Chris had known Karin, and then in person, and we knew the interview was coming up, time and space, look at the questions to revise them if necessary. I think it sounds like those were both essential components, particularly in a Japanese culture where that's already the norm, which maybe it should be the norm for everybody, right? Versus something less familiar. I'm curious to see what will happen if we interview the South American or Central American, where it's a little more lax, those relationships and that rapport. But I don't know.
I have to say, Chris, I'm surprised to hear that you had rehearsed with Karin, because the candor and you all have been working together, but she seemed like a very funny, like she was like making jokes, and it was very like
I don't know if she rehearsed for jokes or not, but
I'm surprised to hear that there had been some rehearsal. It seems so like fluent and casual. It was great.
Yeah, I think the rapport definitely helped, but I think it did. I think the rehearsals was more about like making sure that the messages that she wanted to get across about her views of education or accurate to what she actually, believes. I think it's also when you're working with other, I mean, not just people from other countries, but just in general, right? Like putting in that effort to show that you're trying to understand their perspective and like where they're coming from. It was interesting. Like when I was in Denmark, I would hear a lot of people say like, "Oh, Denmark's such a small country. Like, why do you want to know about us?" And just sort of that, I don't know, just like putting forward that effort of like, well, no, I mean, every system like inherently has value, and I think there's a lot we can learn from each other, and just trying to show like that I had put some effort into understanding, or at least learning about, the system there and what was unique about it and what was different. I think goes a long way. So that's something I think to think about when you're considering trying to work with people from other countries, especially in topics of education.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. I think, well, this was already kind of brought up as an obstacle because it is a challenge. It required many turns from Ben, I know, in between, invested a lot of time in this product. And I think it could be an obstacle, but also knowing that at the end, it's an opportunity. So you guys like to share a little bit about this intersection of obstacle and opportunity, or maybe on either end of the spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think Adria, you're probably talking about the language aspect, and I did the intro. I chose to do the intro to the interview in Japanese, not to kind of like show off or anything, because it was actually very bad in a lot of ways. I've listened to it now. I'm like, that's not what I'm supposed to say there, but. The pronunciation is slightly off. The cadence is actually what I was struggling with the most. But what made it most challenging is if you asked me to tell you about Ushiwata Sensei in Japanese, I could sit down and tell you all about him. But that wouldn't, going back to the kind of language formality, that wouldn't be what I would want to be put on an interview. I wouldn't want that to be like a published thing. I want it to be nice and polished and using those proper, verb endings in that higher register. So I have to give my wife a lot of credit for helping me to put that script together. But then when it came down to it, was a lot of the titles and like the titles of because Ushiwata Sensei has a very storied career of like all these different organizations and positions that he's been in. Very, very amazing. When my wife was helping me to translate it, she was like, "Oh my God, this is amazing." But like, the word president, we could say the president of a company, you could say the president of a university. In English, the word's the same, but there's very different words for like the president of a company. Well, not very different, but there's different words for president of a company and president of like a school or of a department, or, so that's where like some of the feedback after I'd done a couple of the first drafts was like, "Oh, but you said kaicho, but that should be gakucho." So it's like, wow. Getting the titles right was tricky for me, and just learning, okay, this is how you would say this. For example, the humanities department or something like that. These were new things for me that I had never used, words I'd never used in Japanese before, but also learning the exact titles and the nuances there, I think was tricky, but also a good, as you said, an opportunity for me to learn a bit more about how those titles and things are used.
Yeah. I think for me, the obstacles that were present is really more like around those nuances of where there are differences in the system and where there are similarities. Yeah. In some ways, like because Karen, like many Danish people, like her English is so fluent, it's like very easy to just sort of fall into the assumption that you're both talking about the exact same thing, because there isn't, like for me on my end, and it doesn't seem like on her end, like there isn't that same kind of friction between the language as might be present otherwise. But then starting to realize like, oh, actually we are talking about kind of these changes that seem subtle on the surface, but then when you really like interrogate them a little bit more, it's like, oh, these are actually pretty like major differences in how you're understanding the role of teacher education and schooling in your country versus the way that we're talking about it here.
I'm thinking specifically about the idea of teacher shortages, right? Like her description of that, and then you're like, oh, so low pay, and she was like, no,
Yeah, right.
teachers really
Just
well.
some of these other norms that I don't know, it's interesting because it's like, okay, are we actually understanding each other in the same way? But then I think it helps because it really highlights, like for me, that really highlighted how, oh, this is just an assumption I'm operating with
Yeah.
all of the time that doesn't exist in the same way for her and her understanding of schooling.
Yeah.
So that's I don't know, just every time I if I rewatch that video or I just like look back at the notes and think about it, I glean something slightly different from the interaction.
Yeah, and I thinking about this, we're talking, I think we're talking about the same thing, but maybe not exactly the same. As I really was, my research interests are like around teacher preparation for language development, right? For preparing teachers to work with linguistically diverse students in classrooms. And so I was very curious about like how that's happening. English is compulsory now in Japan, or it will be compulsory for elementary school up. So that presents like a huge training, teacher preparation challenge for the country. So I was very curious about that, and I wanted to ask him about that. And in the pre-interview, I mentioned like, oh, I'd like to have a question about like how the Japanese national teacher preparation system is working on preparing teachers for English education. He's like, oh, I don't know anything about that. Just like, I don't know. And it's like, that's not my field. I don't know that. Like, and so things that I saw as like very big, like the English preparing for teaching English, or like the classic Japanese lesson study, which is often cited when we're thinking about teacher preparation. And I asked him about that as well too, and he's like, I don't really know. I mean, I can tell you what it is, but it's like that's not my field, right? So it was important for me to not like essentialize him as a Japanese teacher educator and scholar as knowing everything about everything related to Japanese teacher education, right? He's very much centered on administration, leadership, and kind of big picture stuff. Where I was like, I wanted to know like the nitty gritty, and he's like, I don't know, So.
Yeah. Interesting. Any other opportunities from these interviews, or obstacles, or maybe even we can move into advice for anybody thinking about engaging in not just an interview, but also perhaps research. We just kept getting the emails about, oh, now I forget the name of the big fellowship. The international fellowship that you had, Chris.
Fulbright.
Thank you.
Fulbright. Yeah.
I'll have to edit that out. Of the Fulbright scholars.
You want to restart that again? Yeah.
And thinking how that matters, and like what advice would you give for somebody thinking about engaging in these relationships?
I definitely want to hear Chris's answer. But one thing, if you don't mind, if I can just real quick put mine out there, and then I want to hear your answer, Chris, because I'm definitely curious. But I think for me, what was the best opportunity for me was to kind of, and we talked about this a little bit in the beginning, right? But it was to see the American context in a new light, to see my own context in a new light from somebody else's position, how they've looked at things like the Ryan Act or the Holmes Group, things that maybe aren't very important to me. It's like what's that phrase? Like the fish would be the last animal to discover water, right? You're living in it. You don't see the value of it. You don't even see what it is until you're outside of it, So that to me was one of the bigger opportunities of like to kind of reimagine my own context from a new perspective.
Yeah, honestly, my answer is almost the exact same. I think, right, it's easy to kind of get into this mindset of like, oh, the grass was always greener, right? And like, if we were just more like X country, things would be so much better here. Like I'm definitely guilty of having that sort of thought process at times. But starting to realize like, well, first, it's not that simple. Like you can't just import these like small pieces of a system somewhere else. So I think recognizing that is a big opportunity that's come from working with scholars from other countries. And then secondly, to your point, Ben, of it helps you see your own system differently. So I think that's one of the biggest things that I've taken away from working with Karin and with other people in Denmark. Just understanding better how the California teacher ed system and teacher education in America in general works, because then it helps us better pinpoint, well, where can we make changes or where can we make improvements? And what are the strengths of our system that sometimes it's easy to sort of gloss over when you're in it every single day.
And all you can see are the problems.
Yeah, exactly. So
I like that a lot. I feel like those were opportunities and advice. Did we give advice yet? Or just no advice?
no, there's definitely advice. I guess my advice is like advice in establishing relationships with other scholars. I think people want to, people want to share about their work. Like people want to talk about what they're interested in, especially in these types of fields. It's like, I mean, both with Karin and with Ushiwata sensei, like they've devoted their entire professional lives to these issues. So they care very deeply about it. So I think when you come along and say like, your work and what you're doing has really caught my interest, like I'd really like to learn more about what you think on these things, that's something that I think can go a long way. And then especially when you couple it with kind of front loading some of the work on your own end of like, well, this is what I think I'm understanding about Danish school system or Japanese school systems. Does this seem right? Or can you, share more insight, that sort of thing? I think that really helps. Like people don't want to feel like you're just trying to take something from them, right? So I just want to take the answer and then go back and apply it. But when you're really showing that you want to genuinely build that collaboration and understanding, I think it goes a long way.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add to that. I think that's exactly the advice that I would give. I would probably just add, the things that we've already talked about, like not to essentialize this scholar as being knowledgeable about everything that's in that country's education system or teacher preparation system in this case. And, not to assume, hopefully if someone's doing this kind of, border crossing work or this national work, then they're understanding the conventions of the social conventions, the speaking conventions, hopefully they understand that. I think that goes without saying, but also being careful that not to assume these conventions are the same, right? Maybe they are, but not to assume that they are, and not to essentialize that person as being the representative of that country and everything within it,
Yeah.
It sounds to me like, one, don't be afraid to knock on the door. Two, make sure that you're opening a two-way door, right? That's going to go both ways. And three, that communication and clarity and seeking clarity and reaffirming that kind of being on the same page, that humility are all really essential attributes to engaging in these conversations. I'm actually reminded of something that you said, Ben, about like thinking, okay, it has to be this formal thing with Ushiwata sensei, but then he's like, oh no, we can kind of like, I almost was thinking go American and be pretty laid back with that first conversation, because he knew that that's what you would be expecting. But it was a dialogue and there was communication and clarity with that, like openness to either way, which I think is really
absolutely
right.
Yeah, I think just the accepting that you're going to make mistakes, like that's true in anything, but especially when you're talking about like international collaboration, right? Like if there's other languages at play, other cultures at play, like you're gonna make some sort of faux pas. Like you just will. I can't tell you how many times I've done that, right, in another setting. And so just trying to have some grace with each other about when that happens.
And also be willing to call each other out on it so that you can learn from it, but in a way that's going to move the conversation forward and to deepen each other's understanding. Whether it's simple as, oh, we pay our teachers well here, versus that comment always in my head. Like, yeah, of course they do. Of course they do. But yeah.
I think there's also like, I don't know, do you think this is coincidental, Ben? But like we both ended up kind of gravitating towards people who also had spent time abroad. right? So it's like, that's like your example with the Keigo dialogue, is a perfect one, right? Like Ushiwata sensei had spent time here, so he knew that you'd have a different expectation. And Karma's the same way. She spent time in the States. So I don't know if that's like probably
maybe
people would
it's
go on to that.
yeah, maybe it's a testament to just the mutual kind of, you know, camaraderie that we're building and hoping for in these interviews, right? So for people who are excited to do them,
Right.
they're motivated prior to that, the invitation to actually be part of that collaborative effort. I mean, Ushiwata Sensei, like that was his whole career was built on this collaboration and really taking these ideas and from smaller movements in California and the US back to Japan. So, you know, he's started on the foot of collaboration and continuing along. So
Wonderful. I must say I'm impressed very much by both of you in your interactions and your commitment to pursuing them despite the mistakes and despite the back steps and wait, what was that? And really putting the effort into that, because there's so many places where this could have gone wrong. This could have gone sideways. Relationships could have been burned, and it wasn't. And I think it's very much a testament, not just to the scholars' part, but also to yours as scholars and as building these relationships and really being humble enough to move forward with that and learn from it, and then share your learning with the hundreds, literally, of YouTubers who've been watching these interviews, which has been really exciting for me to see when I check people's stats.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
Well, and I have to give you a lot of credit, a lot more credit than people would know of how much hard work you put into putting together the Ushiwata interview and the transcript and editing and communicating. So I just really do appreciate everything, all the work that you put into it as well too.
I just get to learn from it. I feel very like, how do I get this job? It's exciting. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I second that. Thank you very much, Adria, for your hard work on all this.
You're welcome. Thank you both. Any other things before we conclude our kitchen table talk? That is not at anybody's kitchen table, I believe.
I almost moved my computer to the kitchen table, but then I thought, you know what, that joke's not going to be as funny to everybody else as it is to me. So I'm still in my office here. So
and my dog is sleeping under the table, and if I disturbed him, it would have been a mess. So yeah. Well then.
Well, thank you, Adria, for organizing this, and Chris, it was great chatting with you, and hopefully we can continue it again.